Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to be here and to have this opportunity, as well as seeing so many people turn out. I'm surprised on this gorgeous day. I thought you'd all be taking walks along the water somewhere, so I'm honored. I had a rewarding experience recently that I wanted to start off the talk with. I'm going to be talking about perception, process, and resolution, and especially as pertaining to this group of work that is hanging at Greenhut Galleries now. I had a rewarding experience recently in which I was directing a student on how to tone a canvas, and I noticed that she was dipping the brush a lot and using vertical and horizontal brush strokes to push the paint around. And I commented to her that she was pulling the paint, and I suggested that she grab a large amount of paint, load the brush, start in the middle of the canvas, and push it out to the center from the center to the edges of the canvas. And I suggested that she recall the activity of vacuuming. Moving out from an area where she's standing and pushing it out to where she wanted to clean. So she followed my directive, which was thrilling, to watch her move in a more free-form way, pushing a lot of paint around, and all of a sudden she started giggling and laughing like she had let loose of some sort of boundary or rule, some perception about the activity of painting that she had within her. And so that's how I got the inspiration for talking about this, because I have recognized this in a lot of the teaching that I do, that there seems to be these preconceived notions from somewhere in one's history or background. The author Bo Lotto writes in his recent work, Deviate, that perception is informed by our historical and empirical experiences. More simply, he writes, our brain is our history. With more experience, education, practice, and social interactions through our lives, future histories are created in our brains, building new perceptions. So I thought that was really interesting. So I reached back into my history to pull up a few historical experiences, references that might help me walk through my life and my perceptions, especially as pertains to this work. Aside from grade school and a wonderful high school education, I had a lot of background with visiting my aunts and uncles' farms, my grandparents' farms. And so there was a lot of taking care of animals, bringing the cows in from pasture, corralling turkeys, slopping the hogs, running field corn through the grinder, the wonderful fragrances of strawberries during strawberry picking time, sewing cloth, I sewed my own clothes, the smell of fresh cut hay, the heat of when it's baled, the sounds of locusts in the summer, the dairy smell of the summer kitchen, where my grandparents separated cream from milk. That smell is so strong in my mind. So one of the experiences that I wanted to recall was a walk in the woods with my grandfather. He was trying to find a young sapling to make a whistle for me. And one of the things he counseled during the walk was, Tina, as you grow into a young woman, there will be times of trouble in your life, and go to the woods to find peace and the answer. So this seemed to be appropriate with these paintings, because many of them most of them show that I was in the deep woods. For instance, this one, Tanglewood Morning, was painted in Lincolnville, Maine, I backpacked into the woods along the riverbed of the Duck Trap River. Last fall, I began this painting. And the one across the way, Tanglewood Afternoon, was done in the afternoon. So I would backpack into this wonderful wooded area where there were no people, because I was there in October, taking the two canvases, staying for a morning to paint this work, Tanglewood Morning, and this work, Tanglewood Afternoon. And I went back multiple times last fall and returned this August again to capture more information that I didn't feel I had enough of to resolve the painting. Also, the memory of painting for the first time on site when I was a young teen at my grandparents' house. And it was in autumn, and there's this deep valley behind their house, and looked up onto a ridge with all these trees that I thought looked like the Trix cereal. Do you, any one of you remember Trix cereal? Little kicks like puffballs that were all different neutral colors. Yeah, like Fruit Loops, yeah. Only they were little balls. Yeah, very much like those. Okay, so I sat down in the ground with my paints and canvas and tried multiple times to do this painting, and it was very unsuccessful because I was working with paint from the tube. So, but I remember the promise I made to myself, which was someday I will learn how to do that. So I gave myself a directive when I was like 14 years old, maybe. And then there are memories of fishing in farm ponds. I love swimming in the public pool. And later in married life, a lot of backpacking and canoeing and fishing in Maine and Canada and Missouri. And so that brings us to the painting Rocks and Water. So I could not do this painting without remembering all the canoeing my former husband and I did, canoeing through Whitewater, having an accident up in Grand Lake Stream where our canoe went under, fishing for brook trout in Washington County, Maine. So I'm thinking about these things as I'm painting. I've had a lot of adventures in my life. I've moved 55 times up till now. I've lived in the Philippines for 2 years, Italy for 3. I've lived all up and down the East Coast, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio. Done a lot of traveling, and that's informed my work. One of the things I wanted to bring to your attention was this painting here, Rectangle Rock. When I look at this painting and think about it, I recall the rainy season when I lived in the Philippines. In the rainy season, which was about January through February or March, I remember well my perception of heat. The earth was so hot there, it's very humid, and we would get these deluge in the beginning or the end of the day, and after the rain plummeted down, the sun came out, and this great steam raised off the ground. And it was just the feeling of the heat. And on this day, we had had storms going through the East Blue Hill area, and I could see the dark sky in the distance. And this painting was done in one strike. So I know, it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes they do. But I went back to it repeatedly, taking the painting back to the site to bring it to more of a resolution. And every time I touched it again with my brush, it just said no. And it's about this conversation that I have with my paintings when I'm in the process of bringing them to resolution, or when I'm in the process of painting them. So I decided to leave it as it was because it felt like heat to me. And it was a very hot, humid day. So those were my first perceptions early in life. And as my life has progressed and I've had more study and painted more, I have learned a great deal more about color and surface, which I wanted to bring up in regards to the paintings on the back wall. And I'll bring over, could you bring over that painting, John, of the little apple? Okay, so my undergraduate training was at the University of Cincinnati, and that was my first experience with limitations, which brings me to process. Thank you. Will you want to hold it?
If you want.
It'll be better because I'm shaking a little. I don't want to drop it.
There we go.
Wonderful. Okay, so my first experience with limitations was that I could not go to a fine art program in either music or painting because our family didn't have the funds. So I enrolled in a work-study program at the University of Cincinnati in the Department of Fashion Design and Illustration. And from that, I learned all about texture, cloth, the various reactions, the feels, the drape of various clothing and various fabrics. I also learned a great deal about master paintings because in order to study the history of fashion, one has to study portrait and figure paintings. Introduced me to the huge array of the masters, like Titian, Velázquez, and so forth. Painters that have been very important to me in my painting. And working from the model with ink and brush. That was another really strong influence from taking fashion design and illustration. Perhaps I wouldn't have gotten that kind of education in a fine art program. And as well, I learned independence because I put myself through school and I didn't have huge loans to pay off when I graduated, and I walked right into a job. So there were things that I've learned about life that one can really learn and be very creative through setting their own directives or limitations, which brings me to this painting. If you will notice, this one as well as several small still lifes in the show, you can see the frayed edges of the linen. So this linen is very coarse, not something I normally would paint on in a small painting, but I wanted the experience of doing it. So in graduate school, one of the things that I did was set limits. My directives were to work in an 8 by 8 inch square on various surfaces of canvas and muslin, and I would only work with one item and learn all about composition. So those were directives I set for myself. What I learned was there's a different reaction of paint to different surfaces. Different surfaces give the artist more or less time to complete or resolve a painting. A fast surface like slick muslin, that's a muslin that's smooth, I can do a painting more readily because the fabric isn't stopping the paint. Whereas a thicker canvas like this, heavier canvas, a deeper weave, wants more paint in the valleys of the fabric, which asks me to do one of two things or both. One, continue painting on it until the valleys are filled and the form is realized, or use the palette knife, push the paint into the valleys of the canvas, arriving at a resolution more quickly. Thanks. Thanks, John. So that's reaching back to a long time ago, pulling into the to now, through graduate school to now, to my painting in this exhibit. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So, for instance, let's go over here to this painting. So this painting is muslin, much like the muslin quilters would use on the back of a quilted blanket. And I've mounted it on a wood panel. And this painting was done at the top of Mount Batty, and it's the view of Camden Harbor. And if you have a chance after the talk, you'll see that you can see very active brush strokes. And that's the response of the brush and the paint to the smooth surface of the muslin. So this is another painting that was resolved in one sitting, or one standing, because I was standing. Whereas this painting is a heavier canvas, and there's a lot more paint on it, and it took more time to resolve. So because the canvas was a heavier canvas, it allowed me the ability to go back and put more paint on it. And so I thought I'd show you this. Oops. So this is a board that Roy put up for me. I had these reproductions made for the purpose of this talk. And I wanted to bring up the topic of working from photograph, which I do not do. However, I take photographs often in the midst of the process of doing a painting, because for me, the structure of a painting or the structure of the land is so important in doing landscape painting. And after the first strike, le premier coup, this is how that painting on the back wall looked, Tanglewood Morning. So this was after 3 hours of painting. So I was really successful in getting a lot of paint down first time around. That doesn't always happen, but that is my directive that I give myself in the process of doing a work. So then this picture,
What's your directive again?
did you not did I?
To get as much down.
To get as much down, I'm sorry.
It's
To
okay.
get as much, no, please ask. I'm glad you did. Yeah, if anybody has a question, if I'm not clear while I'm speaking, please stop. Thanks. Okay, so this is a photograph of the place I was painting. So for people who work from photograph, I ask myself why. Did this give me the kind of information that I needed to come up with the structure of the land? Say, what's happening behind those trees? Can we tell? So if I were to work from this painting, it would be an entirely different tradition of painting I would be working in. Would it not? Not almost non-representational. There's nothing there for me. There's no information. So in the process of doing that painting, John, would you bring it over? Because I just realized everybody's going like that to see it, and they can't really see it, especially in relationship to the imagery. Thanks. What stymied me about this site was what was happening behind these trees, and what was the land doing. And I knew on my far right there was this great big cliff, because when the 4-H'ers would come in, they would stand up on top of the cliff and hailed down to me. So, but I couldn't see what was back here. And in looking back at the painting, I saw there was this area of light. And I realized that back here, there was a mound of earth and rock that the trees were growing from. And so when I went back, I was able to paint with that knowledge in my mind, okay? So for me, that was really important. And I wouldn't have called it resolved had I not seen that by going back to the site time and time again. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, yeah.
It seems like you chose to alter where the orange white spots in your painting is for compositional purposes of your own, rather than take the one. You see what I'm referring to?
Oh, I do, which brings up the next comment. Would you like to bring over another
Sure.
painting for me? Trees and rocks, McCurd Cove. Okay, so in this particular instance, I hadn't taken a picture of the painting in process. I get so involved in the painting that the moment passes when the water's at the right tide level, and I'm so lost in my work and the revelations that I discover while I'm painting, which I'll talk about in just a moment, of a mink family. But as far as answering Dan's question, which was about the relationship of the orange passage of trees compared to my painting and the photograph. Again, I take the photograph just for the purpose of finding structure or giving me information that I'm missing in the painting that I need to resolve it. So no, there was no conscious decision to use a different placement of the orange leaves. What happens here is that my vision is different from the camera's lens. The camera's lens, when you're pointing at an area, it's almost like the lens is aiming an arrow at the target, right? And the kind of looking that I do is more of a receptive looking. And I have the ability to move my head, and so I can grab what's below me, what's beyond me, and what's above me. And those are choices that I make instinctively and in the process of painting that have nothing to do with anything else, but I'm painting in a responsive way. So the other thing I might point out to you is that this ratio of length to width is different from the canvas I have. So all of the localities within the painting or within the actual site will wind up in a different, who knows where it'll wind up within the painting. Although I do a lot of measuring, but I do them for the purpose of the picture plane. How am I going to get the information that's in front of me on the picture plane in such a way that it's balanced, that it's a good representation of the place, and that the color relationships are working. So let's go back to this painting, which also further illustrates your question and my point. So this is a camera lens taking a picture of the site. This is what I arrived at in my painting, and there's such a big difference. One of the things about this painting, could you hold it up a little higher? Is that possible? Is that I was able to depict the roundness and the form of this hill beyond the rocks. It's just not in the photograph. And how, so I was at a place at eye level, which was like my eye level was probably right about in here. So I was looking up at the tree, I was looking on at the hillside and down at the rocks below me. Whereas in this photograph, notice that this rock here is seen in perspective, as if I were sitting down in front of it and slightly above it. But this depicts where I really was. So that's the difference that one gets, or that I get, when I paint from sight rather than photograph. We have this ability to take in all this peripheral that the camera lens doesn't grab. Okay, so thanks, John.
Okay, you have the photograph and the painting, and the photograph was dark, and there were lots of dark greens. How do you make your decisions about
Oh, green?
green? Oh, okay, green, yeah. Or yeah.
It's a wonderful teaching point that I've taught in my plein air classes. Interesting scientific discoveries in studying infants and toddlers and how they react to color. This is in response to your question. I just learned about that this summer. Because they haven't learned language yet, they react with the right side of their brain, and they study their eye movements. And they're doing this at the University of Missouri. I think the study is color naming in children. But when they learn language and they learn to name a color, they use the left side of their brain. So actually, learning language changes our brain. It's not the other way around. Our brain does not really organize, does not tell us how to learn a language. Learning the language actually changes how our brain works, which I found was very interesting. So to answer your question about the greens, it's easier for us to discern color categories. Like it's easier for us to tell an orange from a blue and a red, or a yellow from a violet, than it is for us to see the intricate shifts in greens. And green is problematic because there's so much of it, especially when you're painting in the summer. Somebody said to me the other day, green, the landscape in the summer actually is like a barricade. You can't see through it, which is true compared to what you see in autumn and winter, and even spring. Which brings me to this painting. This painting is Eagle's Hangout. So I painted this in the spring, actually, but the earth tones on the hillside are very warm. So that's one part of the answer to your question, that whenever you can see a warm tone to juxtapose to any of the greens you're painting, that gives you the ability to discern green better, because you're seeing the green not as green, but in response to a warm tone. Yes, in a relational manner. Okay, so, and the other thing is that the greens of spring happen to be a little cooler than the warmth of the greens that we see in the summer. Thanks. So then the other thing I would say is, this was my easy answer to finding greens, is when you're looking at a passage of greens in the landscape, to discern whether they're red, yellow, or blue. Relate them to the primary colors. Is that green a reddish green? Does it relate more to red? Is it a yellow green, or is it a cool blue green? And what do you do with the greens that are off in the distance but appear bright when you're looking at the landscape? So this painting behind you, is it McCurd? Okay. So this was a very problematic painting. I almost didn't put it in the show. At one point, I was struggling so much with it, so we'll get into the topic of resolution. how do I resolve a painting? What happens that takes the painting from process into the process of resolution? And I have to say that resolution is part of all of what I'm speaking to today. Resolution has to do with perception. It has to do with the process that I was in while I was painting it, and to address the issue of resolving it. What are some of the things that I pull on or pull from to resolve any given painting, or even a body of work for that matter? But specifically for this painting, let me give you a synopsis of how I spent my summer. I started this, I'm going to get back to answering this, or talking about this, but, well, I'll go right to it. I spent from May to August traveling. I put 6,000 miles on my car, traveling between Bath and East Blue Hill, or Camden and East Blue Hill. And I was staying at an inn, High Tide Inn. My friend here, Joe, owns the inn. I stayed there as my sort of kicking off point, traveling up and down the coast, or down east. And this painting I almost didn't paint because the scene or the place was so beautiful. It was like, I can't believe this place. I can't believe I found this place, which was in the backyard of a woman's home on the little road that goes through East Blue Hill. Her name was Eileen. She was so sweet. So she saw me painting this painting over here, McCurd's Rocky Cove, and I was painting it from the bridge, which was fine. I really like this painting because that again was during that period of storms, and I felt like I captured the sky, and I was really racing with the tide coming in at low tide, and at one point it started to rain, and I had to cover the painting with plastic that I happened to have on hand, and I decided to stay and wait it out, and I'm so glad I did because it was just a shower. But anyway, I painted this painting, McCurd's Rocky Cove, from her backyard because she saw me and she said, "Oh, I've been watching you paint here. Would you like to paint from my backyard?" And I, of course, said yes, because I had noticed I kind of snuck around and would look behind, and I knew there was this wonderful place back there. So I continued to paint through June and July and the first part of August back there. So this place was so beautiful that it almost was too beautiful to paint. And it was just a place to go to and be quiet. And there were eagles there, and there were ducks. And there was this family of mink. So I was doing this painting here of the rocks and the trees. And I was standing at the edge of the cliff, which was in front of the little waterfall, which is in this painting and in this painting. And I heard this high-pitched barking and squeaking, and I was looking into the water because the tide was coming in. I was looking into the water to see what was making that noise, and I saw this little brown, beautiful brown animal about this long, a little guy or girl, and her fur was glistening in the water, and she was chirping, and she was pretty much skimming over the top of the water and rocks. Not swimming, not climbing, just sort of, and squeaking all the time. It was just wonderful. And so I kind of looked over the edge of the cliff to see if I could find where it had gone, and I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. And then a few more minutes went by, and here comes another one scampering over the rocks and water. And this one is bigger. So I realized that this one was the mama. And she was going back and forth, and with each trip, another little one would come in front of her or behind her. And the funny thing was, the mother had a very direct route, and the little ones were all over the place. But they all wound up under the cliff where I was painting. And there was more and more noise, and I thought, I have got to see what's going on down there, you know? And so I looked over, and I looked up, and there she was, standing on her haunches, sort of looking right at me, with her big red-brown, rusty eyes. And it was just this clinching moment that just stopped me short. And so that perception and that experience helped feed how to resolve this painting. It was the memory, it was the experience, it was the love of the place that I pulled into resolving that painting. So as far as green goes in this painting, getting back to the topic of greens, the distant greens in this particular painting were very bright, or very yellow-green in the sunlight that was hitting them. And painting them that way just didn't work, because there's a lot of spatial context in this place. And so I continually worked with glazing of the color of the sky. First, an opposing color like a peach tone or a light warm tint, and would pass it over the sky, and then a light blue tint over that. And I continually worked at pushing the trees back, which gave me the possibility of bringing the rocks even further into the foreground. So again, it had to do with relationships. So those are some of the considerations that I go through in resolving a painting. So it's all part of the process, and which I haven't spoken about yet, is what was I doing while I was driving. So this feeds into the message, I think, that might be in these paintings. I started the group last October, which was just before the election. And I continued it in May and painted daily between May and August. There were only a few days that I didn't paint to rest, but for the most often I would say I painted about 5 or 6 days a week. Right, Joe? This painting here, the 3 large paintings, the one in the window, which is Source, and this one, Dune, and the one over there is Tree Span. Those 3 paintings I began in about 2013, 14. The whole body of work that I did, which is about 30 to 35 paintings now, I began in 2010. And the topic was the erosion of Popham Beach, which I have been visiting since 1967 or 8. And so these 2 paintings here were 2 of the group that were painted along the way during between 2012 and 16. So this one is Threshold, and this one is Sentinel and Sun. What compelled me to work there for so long was the beauty that I saw at the beach, but also the very rapid erosion that was occurring with the, it's in the window, Source, the Morse River coming into the beach and changing the course of the river and the sand. And it just did a real job on this wooded area that was further out beyond the dune at one point. And I decided to paint the dune. So the first paintings were done looking up at the dune away from the ocean. And I was intrigued because I couldn't see the horizon line, which is a difficult thing to consider when you're a landscape painter. What do you do with the horizon line? What do you do with the foreground? And this subject matter just gave me all the answers. I didn't have to worry. I was looking up. So it was a lot of looking upward and painting into the trees, painting the shadows under the turf were very compelling to me. So I'm going to stop and tell a story. So I was the dune troll for 5 years. I didn't want to be, but I became the dune troll because people would literally grab onto these roots and pull themselves up to the top of the dune. And I remember one particular parent telling her child to do that, literally instructed her to do that. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing and seeing. And the little girl, when she got to the top of the sand, she was frightened, and the mother said, just ski down on your feet. And the little girl said, no, Mommy, no. And the parent went up and did it for her, showed her how to do it. So I began to speak out. Protect the dune. The trees are falling. They continue to fall. And it's not just the weather and the river. We contribute to some degree to the spoilage of our earth. And I became more and more conscious about it. It was just something that compelled me to paint them. And then I turned finally, oh, look at this gorgeous ocean. So I started a group of triptychs of the circumference of the beach. And these three here are the first series, the first group of paintings of my response to the dune, the river, and the tree span. And what I wanted you to see here was these paintings were very large, and I did take them with me on site. So in some of them you'll see there's sand in the paint. I didn't bring sand home and throw it on the wet paint. It's really in the paint because of carrying it out, putting it down, picking it up. So the other thing that I did a year before beginning this group was to do studies so that I would have them to refer back to. So, this is source, and this is dune, and this is tree span, which is this way. So I had those in my studio to refer to when I brought the canvases back to paint through the winter if I needed to. And the other thing I'll say about that is this is plywood, and I've prepared it so that the tannins of the wood won't come through the paint. But it's a very smooth surface, even more smooth than the muslin that I work on. So it allowed me to push the paint around very rapidly and come to resolution in these studies quite quickly. Whereas if it had been canvas, it wouldn't have gone so easily. Okay. So I'll just close with one more point I'd like to make about this process. While I was driving the 6,000 miles, I was listening to the news. So it was an hour and a half to East Blue Hill, an hour and a half back. That's 3 hours of news a day. And I did not turn that radio off because I set that as my limitation. I'm going to work in spite and in response to what is going on. I'm not going to keep it from my creativity. I'm not going to keep it from my joy. And I'm going to continue to paint this beautiful, beautiful earth. And so that's what helped me resolve this painting. And I think for me, resolution for me comes in a moment of quiet. I don't force a painting. I won't do that to a painting. I'll paint with it. I do a lot of looking as it grows closer and closer to resolution. And what happened with this painting was that because I saw the beginnings of it, it sort of attained a glass-like fragility that I had no intention of painting about. So that's pretty much it. The way to finish it, I thought of this analogy, which I think is perfect. It's like a child asking for, being in front of a painting on the easel, and you're looking at it for the purpose of getting information through a conversation. So a child comes up to you and says, I'm hungry, I want something to eat. The painting will be like that. I am not done yet. I need something from you, the artist. And so, like a child, you give the child what she wants, she becomes satisfied, and she runs away. That's like a painting. You give it what it asks for, it comes to a place of quiet. It just sort of is full. It's done. And that's how I resolve a painting, one of the ways. So that's about it. So anybody have any questions? Thank you. Thanks. Any questions? Yes.
I've known your work for a little while, and during the talk this afternoon, you talked about giving yourself directives. Mm-hmm. Your drawing in these paintings looks very different to me than it did in earlier work.
Like when?
7, 8 years ago.
What is your name?
Barry.
Barry. Oh,
So-
Barry Shock.
right.
Okay. I didn't recognize
So
you for
that's
some
okay.
reason.
So
Yes.
I'm curious about how you chose to render the images you're doing from, on site now as opposed to then. Is it a natural evolution? Is this something you're consciously saying to yourself, like you described this afternoon? You're giving yourself a directive to work, as many plein air painters say, in an abstract way until it comes together. You sort of alluded to that with your description of how you handled the greens and the color.
So 2 questions. The directives had nothing to do with, I'm going to make abstract paintings or do a lot of them in a given period of time. I knew the space, but I also knew that I had a number of the dune paintings that I could use if for any reason there weren't enough paintings to fill the space from my painting from May to August. So that's not the kind of painting I do anymore. Each painting is a response to the next one or the one behind it. And the drawing that I do now is, I use a lot of what I call tangent drawing, which I learned first from Barbara Grossman at the Vermont Studio Center. She's all about drawing. She teaches all these exercises on how to draw. Tangent drawing is, let's see. Well, here's a really good, I haven't talked about this painting. This is the bridge at the Duck Trap, over the Duck Trap River in Lincolnville. I started this painting last fall. This dark area here, if you see there's a right angle where the support of the bridge meets the bottom of the bridge. Where are you, Barry? There you are. So that makes a tangent. A tangent meaning a right angle, an acute angle, an obtuse angle. And it usually is defined by a change in striking value that you might see from the distance, like a dark against a light. It might be where 2 forms overlap. and you'll get something in front of, something behind, and that will make an angle or a tangent. So I'll go through the picture plane and first find blocks, like half, thirds, and mark them on the side of the canvas. And then I'll go through and do a lot of measuring and just mark the tangents. Only the important ones. What that does, it allows me the freedom to move my paint through, in and out areas where there are no tangents. Here's a big one right here, tangent. So there's a stopping place where the turf is meeting the sand in a very light to dark place. Not only does it mark a place, it helps me find tonal relationships, what is light, what is dark, but it also gives me the freedom to move through the painting where there are no tangents. So here I can pull land into sand, a plane on the ground to a plane that's facing me at an angle. And that's what lends itself to what you call abstraction. It's not painting the form, it's painting what we really are looking at, the way life really, the way nature and we are. It all has to do with relationships. So working with tangents, I look around the room. Here's one, this square rectangle of sky coming through trunk and limb. That's a solidifying moment in the painting. And they're marking places. They map where the object is, where the form is. However, these areas here where trees move into trees, those tones are all the same, so I'm very free to paint how I feel about it. What my sensory impulses are coming in at me from mothers telling children to pull themselves up the root of the tree, or seagulls, or minks crying in the wind, you know. It's
Or memories.
our memories. There you go.
The other thing I'm curious about that you spoke about this afternoon is the variation in the surfaces. Was that process of experimentation for you as you became a painter across your lifespan, or was there a material and methods course along the way where somebody said, do this, do that? Yeah.
The only material methods course I had was with Professor John Fania at Brooklyn College, where we learned, which brings up another topic, indirect painting, the process that the master painters used of painting a grisaille first, a tonal painting of grays and whites, letting that dry, and then moving over it with transparent washes of cools and warms to achieve a final.
Fashion illustration.
Pardon?
Training. Maybe that's informed by your fashion illustration.
It is. And so I later painted in watercolor, knowing this is a constant. I rely on constants in my work. That white, the surface of the canvas or the paper, is the lightest light you will ever get. No matter how much white paint you put on it, the surface of the canvas is the most reflective. So with indirect painting, building a grisaille first and then pulling vitrage or transparent washes over it, the grisaille acts, this one was done that way, acts as a surface of a canvas. So if for whatever reason I've covered it with a tone and I don't like it, I can go back and make a new surface. So I do that with a fast drying white paint and then let it dry really, really well, and then pass light, very light transparent washes over it to achieve the desired effect. So that's different than direct painting, which is we got to deal with value, color, temperature, intensity all at once. We mix the tone, we apply it. Whereas indirect painting allows us the ability to go back into a painting that may have started with direct painting. But it again is another ploy, or another, not ploy, another technique to use to free me up.
For responsiveness, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the only course I had was with Paul John Fania, and the surface that he had us work on was wood, surfaced with a lot of different layers, many layers of gesso, sanded smooth in between. And that's really the only guidance I had. I did it all myself from my own directives of making little 8 by 8 inch square panels and mounting different linens and muslins on them. Taught myself. Any questions? Any other questions? Thank you. That was a good question. Going, going, gone. But don't leave. Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.
To paint on it? Do you just wash it and tack it on the board? I mean, how is that done?
It's done with glue. I use it, my teacher, Lennart, would use Elmer's glue, but I wouldn't suggest that. You can buy various adhesives at art stores that are good for conservative purposes, that are pH controlled, and I make sure that the wood surface has no dust on it. I make sure it's nice and clean. I put a thin wash of the glue on the wood panel, and then put it also on the surface of the muslin. Drop the muslin over top of the wood panel. Smooth it out really, really well. I set it up on jars so that the fabric drapes down the side, and let it dry. And then the next day I prepare the sides of the panel with glue and smooth the fabric over the sides, let it dry. And then the next day I do the back. And then I put gesso on it. A mixture of cold pressed linseed oil and I use Gamsol now. I used to use mineral spirits, but the Gamsol is much better for our planet and our health. So I mix a medium, and I started out with a little bit of oil in the medium, and if the painting progresses, then maybe I'll change to a fatter medium with more oil in it. And then if I'm still painting on it and the canvas allows me, if it's a heavy canvas, I'll mix a medium of 75% oil and 25%.
You're using what linseed oil?
Cold press. And the reason I use cold press is because that's how most good paints are made. They're ground pigment with cold pressed linseed oil. So I say to myself, why introduce another oil into the mixture when the...
Because I've used like Galp, yes,
I have tried it. I experiment. So I think that painting... Pardon? Well, thank you. Yeah. What?
Here's the sand.
Yeah, there's the sand. It's down here. It's in here. And this particular canvas is a very, very fine linen. It doesn't have much tooth to it. So it was a difficult painting to progress through because there was a lot of information I wanted to get down. but it was demanding of me. You've got to make your decision now and be done, because there's no time to go back. There's no surface to go back to. So
I never talked to anybody about painting or anything.
no surface to go back to. This was such a difficult area. I had to keep building a new surface, and it was already full. It's really hard. Very difficult.
Great, thank you.
Oh, it's just lovely to see you again.
I had forgotten your connection with fashion.
Oh, of course,
And-
and your bridal
Yeah, and all that.
designs.
So-
We'll work it out. It doesn't have to come to me all at once.
Oh, okay.
You know, it comes over time.
Oh, super.
Yeah. Tangents? I learned it from Barbara Grossman in 1993 at the Vermont Studio Center. There were two other teachers there at the time, Hugh O'Donnell and Marjorie Portnow, and those three people were pivotal in the growth of my work. And so I learned it originally from Barbara Grossman. But I've continued to use it, and I continue to teach it.
Beautiful, beautiful work. It's gorgeous.
Thanks. So great. Well, thanks for coming.
This is, I think,